It's raining. It has been for 2 days. You can't hunt. The tracks you found are gone, washed out of the mud. You can't move far. Wet rock under bare feet is how you break an ankle, and a broken ankle out here is a slow death sentence. You can't even keep warm properly because a wet body pulls heat out of itself faster than it can make it. So you sit in the mouth of a cave with 20 other people, and you wait, and in that waiting, you're cold, bored, going absolutely nowhere. This is where your species invented almost everything. Rope, the sewing needle, tailored clothing, paint, quite possibly storytelling itself. Look at where and when the foundational technologies show up in the archaeological record, and a strange pattern emerges. They don't come from the triumphant days out on the plains. They come from the days people were stuck inside. Let's talk about what a storm actually meant. Today, when it rains, you shut the window, make something hot, and put something on a screen. The sound of rain is the most relaxing noise you know. It's sold to you in apps to help you sleep. You might not make it to the end of the episode. For almost the entire history of your species, that same sound was the sound of a problem you might not survive. Start with the cold. A wet human loses body heat far faster than a dry one. Get wet, get wind chilled, and hypothermia is a matter of hours, not days. And most of the world your ancestors lived in got cold enough at night to do it, even in Africa, at altitude in the wet season. Now add the ground. Caves and rock shelters, the places people actually lived, sit at the bottom of slopes and beside rivers, which is exactly where water goes. Archaeologists find bands of flood sediment laid down inside occupied shelters. The water came in while people were living there. Some of those flood layers are thick enough that the cave was simply never used again, and then the part nobody wants to picture. Rain drove the predators indoors too, and sometimes indoors was your cave. There's a famous early hominin skull found in South Africa with 2 neat punctures in it spaced exactly like the lower canines of a leopard. A predator had carried the body up and eaten it. A storm didn't just make life wet, it squeezed the whole world, people, prey, and the things that ate people, into the same few dry rooms at the same time. So in the middle of all that, one job outranked every other: keep the fire alive. Here's why that was terrifying rather than routine. Humans have been using fire for a very long time. There's burnt material at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa that may go back 1,000,000 years, and solid, repeated hearths at Kasem Cave in Israel around 300,000 years ago. But using a fire and making one from nothing are 2 different skills, and for most of prehistory, it's not at all clear that most people could reliably do the second. Which means if your fire went out, you might not get it back, so you didn't let it. Groups carried fire with them, a smoldering ember wrapped in green leaves or tucked inside a lump of tinder fungus, a woody bracket that can hold a coal alive inside itself for hours. A living lighter you kept in a pouch. We know how seriously people took this because when they found Otzi, the 5,000-year-old man who melted out of an alpine glacier, he was carrying a dedicated fire kit: tinder fungus, flint, a piece of iron pyrite for throwing sparks, spare tinder as backup. 5,000 years ago, losing your fire was a serious enough prospect that you carried insurance against it. When the rain came then, the fire was the first priority, not shelter. Move it deeper in, screen it with hides, feed it carefully because too much smothers it and too little starves it. And go and find fuel that a downpour hasn't ruined. Dead lower branches still sheltered under a conifer's own canopy, dry on the underside. The dry heartwood inside a split wet log. Birch bark, which carries an oil that catches even soaking wet. One person's whole night might be nothing but sitting with that fire, shielding it, because the fire was warmth and light and safety and cooked food in the center of every conversation the group would have. Letting it die wasn't carelessness. It could kill everyone. All right, the fire's holding. You're more or less dry, and you still cannot leave. So what do you do stuck inside for days, sometimes weeks? This is where the archaeology stops being grim and starts being extraordinary. Because the floors of these caves are packed with the evidence of people making things. Stone tools at every stage of production. Little concentrated scatters of flaking debris, the sharp chips that fly off when you're shaping a blade, found in exactly the spots where someone would have sat near the light and worked for hours. And it wasn't only stone. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, there's a 100,000-year-old pigment workshop, abalone shells used as mixing dishes, ochre ground to powder, bone tools for stirring and applying it. That is not scraping by. That is a manufacturing process with a recipe carried out on purpose. Somebody sat in that cave, quite possibly with the rain coming down outside, and made paint. Then there are the needles. Fine bone needles, with a tiny eye drilled through one end, begin appearing tens of thousands of years ago. And you do not knock out a bone needle while you're running from anything. You make it sitting still, in good light, with hours to lose and total concentration. That precise, patient, fiddly work is the signature of people with time on their hands and nowhere to be. Rain gave them exactly that. Which brings me to the single best example, the one I can't get past. The oldest piece of string we have ever found is about 50,000 years old. It comes from a rock shelter called Abri du Maras in France, and it was made by Neanderthals. 3 strands of fiber stripped from the inner bark of a conifer and twisted together into cord. To make it, they had to understand which trees and which season and how the fiber behaves. And over in Germany, at Hohlefels, there's a 35,000-year-old tool carved from mammoth ivory with a row of holes and spiral grooves cut into it, a purpose-built device for twisting fiber into rope. Somebody sat in a cave and manufactured a rope-making machine. Making cord is slow, repetitive, endless. It is the perfect thing to do when you can't go outside, and rope is one of those quiet inventions that everything else stands on. It binds a point to a shaft, lashes a shelter together, becomes a snare, a net, a bag, a bowstring. A staggering amount of human technology is downstream of string, and string was almost certainly invented by someone waiting out the weather. They weren't only making tools either, they were making the cave livable. At Sibudu in South Africa, there's bedding, actual bedding, from 77,000 years ago. Compacted mats of sedge and rushes, and laid across the top, a thin layer of Cape laurel leaves, which happened to be a natural insect repellent. And the mats were burned off and relaid periodically to keep the pests down. 77,000 years ago, someone wasn't just surviving in that shelter, they were keeping house. And then, past all the practical things, the tools, the cord, the bedding, there's the thing that makes no survival sense at all. The paintings. Chauvet Cave in France holds images around 36,000 years old. Lions, horses, rhinos, bears, drawn by someone who understood muscle and movement. Animals caught mid-stride with their heads turning. And Chauvet isn't alone. Lascaux, Altamira, and cave art on Sulawesi in Indonesia that runs back at least 45,000 years, the oldest figurative art we know of. Here's the detail that gets me. These paintings mostly aren't near the entrance, where you'd shelter. They're deep, down narrow passages in chambers you have to crawl to reach. Someone carried a little animal fat lamp into total darkness and painted by its light. Nobody does that on a beautiful day when the hunting's good. We can't prove it was the rain, but the logic sits very comfortably. You do that when you can't go out, when you've already resharpened every tool you own and retwisted all the cord you have, and the only thing left is to go deeper into the dark and make something that didn't exist before. And that might be the biggest thing the rain gave us, because it may not have just produced art. It may have produced culture itself. Think about the raw situation. 15 to 30 people sealed into one dry space for days with nothing pressing to do. What happens is you talk, and we have a measurement of what that talk becomes. In 2014, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner compared daytime and firelight conversation among the Jew Hawansi of the Kalahari. Day talk was practical and often sharp, resources, complaints, who did what. But at night, around the fire, the great majority of it turned into stories, singing, the imagined, and the far away. The firelight changed the subject, and the stories weren't idle. Woven through them was the actual survival library of the group, where the water sits in a dry year, which plants won't kill you, how a wounded animal behaves, who can be trusted when it goes wrong. Not gossip. The database moving from one head to the next by being spoken aloud, and some of what got told turns out to be almost unbelievably durable. There are Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe coastlines drowning, stories that match real sea level rises from thousands of years ago, carried across all that time by nothing but people telling them to each other, night after night, until they came true in the record. That kind of memory doesn't form in a species that's always outside and always busy. It forms in the hours people are pinned together with nothing to do but repeat what matters until it sticks. So the rainy days weren't dead time, they were the transmission. The hours when what the old ones knew crossed into the young ones, when skills got shown hand to hand, when the group's whole memory got told again and topped up. And here's the twist the survival story leaves out. The rain wasn't only the crisis. When it stops, the ground is soft, and soft ground takes a perfect track. So some of the finest hunting conditions on Earth come in the hours right after a storm. Rain brings mushrooms up overnight, loosens the soil around tubers, and in tropical Africa triggers the termites to swarm. One of the most protein-dense meals going, no weapon needed, you just gather them. The storm didn't switch the food off, it changed what the food was, and the groups who understood the change ate well while the others went hungry. So, what did ancient humans do when it rained all day? They did the things that turned out to matter most. They kept the fire alive. They made the tools for the next hunt and the needles and the clothes for the next winter. They twisted the rope that everything else was tied to. They ground the ochre and crawled into the dark and put animals on the walls. They told the stories that carried the knowledge and some of the myths forward through thousands of years. And when it finally stopped, they walked out onto soft ground printed with perfect tracks and got back to work. The rain didn't slow them down. It handed them the one thing a hunting and gathering life almost never offers: time. Time to sit still, near a fire, with idle hands and a working mind. Nearly every object your ancestors ever made, every skill they passed on, every image they left on a wall, a huge share of it came out of downtime, out of the hours they were trapped inside with nothing to do but think. They didn't get bored the way you do, because when you're sitting in a cave with the rain hammering the rock, and what you make with your hands in the next few hours is the difference between warm and dead, you don't get bored, you get inventive, and that might be the single biggest reason you're here to be annoyed by the rain at all.